When my son, Ben, was 7 years old, he'd been playing little kid soccer for a while, but now when he was 7, they were starting to up the game, and he was, playing games that actually now had referees, and the referees were beginning to enforce rules like the offside rules, and they were starting to call fouls, and one day, as it happens, there was a little, contact down near the end of the field, and the ref blew the whistle, and Ben raises his hand to say, "It was me, I fouled." And this other father down the sideline standing near me starts yelling at Ben in this voice that went high with his anger at Ben, saying, Ben, what are you doing? You don't call a foul on yourself. You don't do that. Never do that. And I'm thinking, this guy's picking on my son down here. But I didn't say anything. I just rolled my eyes. And I got reminded of something that happened when I was 7 years old, which takes us back to the 1960s. When I was in the first grade at a Catholic school that I absolutely hated. I felt like it was jail. It even looked like a jail. It was a long, low building, one hallway this way, went that way, then this way, then that way, then this way. And at one end was the first grade, and at the other end was the 8th grade. And I was in the first grade, and I felt like I'm going to be 14 when I get out of this place. I have like an 8-year sentence in this. And it was made of cinder blocks, and the classrooms were crowded, and the nuns were crabby and scary and always talking about eternal damnation for the things that we would do when we were 7 years old. And I just hated it and did not ever want to be there. The only time I had a sense of a break and joy was 11:15 every morning. We got 20 minutes of recess. The big metal doors clunked open, ka-chunk, and we got to run out onto the parking lot, and for 20 minutes, the sound of joy finally shot through the air. You could hear jump ropes skipping and balls bouncing and the shouts of children playing games and tag and things like that. And for a little bit of time, I felt I was out of jail and I felt I was free. But then inevitably, the bell would ring and the nuns would come out and they would line us up and we'd have to march back inside and back into jail. And the doors would thunk, close again. And I began to have this fantasy, this wish. Why don't I just have permanent recess? Why should I have to go back inside? But it was just a fantasy because it was a crazy, crazy, dangerous idea. But one day I was out there and I was talking to my friend Patrick, who was one of the more mischievous boys in this class. And I told Patrick about my dream of just having permanent recess. And he said, well, why don't we do it? I said, really? He said, yeah, let's do it. And so there were about 5 minutes left till the bell was going to ring, and we began edging towards the edge of the parking lot where there was a little bit of a wall that separated us from a hill that went down to the busy road down the bottom of the hill. And we got to the end of the wall, we snuck around the end, and we dug down. And we just stayed there crouched as the clock ticked down to the bell ringing. And we finally heard the bell ring, and we heard the nuns come out and assemble the kids. We heard them march inside, and we heard the doors close, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. They were inside, and we were in permanent recess, free. Except almost immediately, we realized we were not free at all. This was a really, really, really terrible idea. We were going to be in very big trouble no matter what happened. And it was scary because we'd never heard the sound of the playground without children out there. It didn't sound like recess. It was this eerie silence. I could hear the birds tweeting, and I could hear the cars down at the end of the road. It didn't feel at all like what I thought it was going to feel like. And I was saying to Patrick, I think we made a mistake. And he said, yeah, I think we did. I said, we can't do anything, because if we start walking around, the first grown-ups we ran into, 2 kids, 7 years old, walking around town, first grown-ups would say, why aren't you kids in school? And then we were going to be in trouble. So we were frozen and getting more and more frightened. And I said, I want to take a look. I want to take a look at the playground to see if anything's going on. So I peeked my head up over the wall and I said, ah! And I ducked back down and Patrick said, what is it? And I said, there's a police car there. They've called the police. And indeed, I had seen 2 cops standing in front of the door, the big heavy doors, and the principal of the school, Sister Rose Gertrude, was out there waving her arms around, her face red. She looked like she was in a panic. And I said to Patrick, oh my gosh, now we're going to go to real jail. This is real jail. All of a sudden, a head leans over the wall. It's one of the police officers. I found him. He marches us out, takes us by the hands, leads us to Sister Rose Gertrude. They drive away, the cops leave. The big doors open, we step inside. We're now in the hallway just inside the doors. My first grade teacher, Sister Mary Alice, comes out. And they look at us, and they are very, 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 very upset. And I'm very, very scared. Now this was, again, the reason I mentioned the 1960s. It was routine in those days for corporal punishment to be part of the plan if the offense was serious enough. And I was thinking, we've crossed over into the serious enough offense zone here. The thing that they would do is they would make you hold your hand open and they would slap you with the ruler. And it really, really, really hurt when that happened. And I was dreading that and thinking that's what was coming. But I wasn't sure because they had some questions for us. And the question was the obvious one. What were you boys thinking? And I looked at them, and I looked at Patrick, and he looked so scared. And I don't know exactly why I did this, but I said, "Sister, this was my idea, not Patrick's idea." And they look at me, and they look at Patrick, and Patrick is doing this totally. And they say nothing, and I'm thinking, is there something worse than a ruler that they're contemplating here? Because they were saying nothing. Until a few seconds later, Sister Rose Gertrude said, "Go back to your classes. We're going to be calling your parents." And Patrick and I went back to the classroom, and it was now around noon, and lunchtime came, and we ate lunch. I could barely swallow, not knowing what the punishment was going to be. And then 3 o'clock came, and the end of the school day came, and the bell rang, and nothing had happened, and I went home. And my mother was there, and she said, "I know what happened. We're going to wait till your father gets home." And I gulped at that because I didn't know what that was going to mean. My father came home, and he and my mother had a talk. And they called me into the living room and said, "Sit down, we want to talk to you." And they sat me down, and they said, "That was a really bad thing that you did. That was a bad move. You scared everybody. It could have gotten much, much worse. So don't do it again." And that was it. A few years ago, my mother was in a nursing home. She was in her 90s. She still had 100% of her brain. And for some reason, we ended up talking about this. I'm not sure if she remembered it or I remembered it. But she said, "You know, John, you know the reason that they didn't punish you?" And I said, "No." And she said, "The nuns were so shocked that you took responsibility. They were so surprised by that. I think you just caught them off guard. And they wanted to just leave it at that." And I would love to say, as we just heard from Maureen, that for the rest of my life, I was just as scrupulous about telling the truth all the time, but I can't quite say that I have been as scrupulous always as I was when I was 7 years old. But when I saw my son call the foul on himself, I thought, okay, I know where that comes from, and maybe it's going to last a little bit longer with him. Thank you very much.